Hey there, ever grabbed like the cheaper item at the store versus the one that, feels a little bit more, I don't know, responsible? But it's more expensive.
It's a classic dilemma.
It really is. And it gets me thinking about how much the conversations we have, or even the ones we think other people are having, play into those decisions.
It's fascinating, isn't it?
It really is. And you sent over some economics research that dives into this exact thing, how public discourse shapes what researchers are calling ethical consumption.
Yeah, and it caught my eye because it's not just like surveying people about their opinions, it's using controlled experiments.
Okay, so get us into that. What kind of experiments are we talking about here?
So they created these simulated marketplaces.
Okay, a simulated marketplace.
Yeah, with real people making decisions about what to buy and sell.
Interesting. And the first study we're looking at today, this was run in both Switzerland and China, right?
That's right.
Which, even that choice of location seems deliberate, right? Like they're trying to prime us to think about cultural differences.
Exactly. There are these common stereotypes, right? Like the Swiss are all about sustainability, willing to pay more for it, whereas other cultures might be more focused on getting the best deal. So the researchers were curious if those stereotypes would hold up in this kind of controlled setting.
Okay, so walk us through this controlled setting. What did they actually do?
Right. So they took groups of 16 people.
16 people.
Right. And within each group, some acted as buyers, some as sellers. Pretty straightforward. They had two products they could trade. One was cheaper to produce, but it had a negative impact baked in, whereas the other one was pricier, but considered the responsible option.
Classic ethical dilemma, then cost versus conscience. How'd they make that negative impact play out in the experiment, though?
Right, so they brought in another factor. A third of the group acted as kind of like bystanders, and they were the ones directly affected by the production choices being made.
Interesting. So it wasn't just theoretical, there were real stakes involved, even if they were just points in this case.
Exactly. They wanted to make it tangible.
Okay, so where does the actual talking part come into this whole marketplace setup?
Right. So that's where they introduced these different conditions. Some groups had a chance to just chat amongst themselves before being assigned roles, buyer, seller, or that impacted bystander. Some groups chatted after rules were established, and within those, some included those bystanders in the conversation, some didn't.
So they're really trying to tease apart the impact of when the conversation happens and who's part of it.
Exactly. And then they looked at how all these variations affected the market share of that responsible but pricier product.
Clever. So, back to Switzerland and China. Were those stereotypes about ethical buying borne out? Like, were the Swiss all over that eco-friendly option right out the gate?
Well, initially, yeah. Without any discussion, the Swiss were already choosing the responsible product around 50% of the time.
Okay, so already pretty good starting point for them.
Right. But the Chinese market, only about 15% were going for the ethical choice right off the bat.
Wow, okay, so pretty big difference there.
Huge.
But what happened when they added in the conversation element? Did that change anything?
It did, and surprisingly so. Just having some kind of chat, regardless of the format, before roles, after roles, with the bystanders, it had a pretty substantial effect.
In both countries?
Yeah, in both Switzerland and China. Now, in Switzerland, ethical buying shot up to nearly 100% after those conversations, which I guess isn't that shocking.
Right, they were already predisposed to care about that, and then the conversations maybe just, solidified that.
Possibly, but here's the real surprise. China saw a similarly dramatic jump, even though they started way lower.
So even with that lower baseline of ethical buying, just having conversation about it had just as much impact.
It seems that way, and that really challenges some assumptions, doesn't it? Maybe those deeply ingrained cultural differences we assume exist matter less than just how open people are to considering other people's values and concerns, once they're actually voiced.
Okay, that is fascinating.
Yeah.
But what about the conversations themselves? What were people saying that sparked these big shifts in behavior?
That's where it gets even more interesting, because it wasn't all just, hey, let's make a deal kind of talk. They'll unpack that a bit more for us when we come back.
All right, we're back. And we left off on a bit of a cliffhanger there. With those conversations that seem to be driving these big swings toward ethical buying in the experiment, what were people actually saying to each other?
So they dug into the chat logs from those experiments. And here's the thing. It wasn't just about prices and, I'll buy this from you and all that.
It wasn't just deal making.
No. People were making ethical arguments. They were trying to persuade each other to consider the impact of their choices, even in this kind of artificial marketplace.
So more like, hey, maybe we shouldn't be profiting at the expense of those bystanders, even if it means we make a little less money ourselves.
Exactly. And what's really interesting is it wasn't just about people coming in with, already strong opinions and trying to preach those.
Right.
A key finding was how much someone was exposed to pro-social arguments from other people. That was the biggest predictor of whether they choose the responsible product, even if they didn't start off saying, oh, this is what I care about.
So it's almost like the conversation itself creates this sort of shared understanding or expectation. Like, okay, this is what we care about as a group, even if I wasn't thinking about it before.
That's a great way to put it. It's less about individuals having these, deeply held values that suddenly change in a 10-minute chat, and more about becoming aware of and influenced by the values and expectations that are being expressed around them.
It's giving me flashbacks to those classic social psychology experiments where, like, people conform to group norms, even when they know it's wrong, just because of the pressure. But in this case, it's like that conformity is being used to nudge people towards better behavior.
It's a fascinating implication, right?
It really is.
It makes you think differently about how we design systems, how we encourage ethical choices, if that's the goal.
Yeah.
It might not be enough to just make people aware of the issues, but to create these opportunities for dialogue, where those issues can be openly discussed and debated. Okay,
so that's super interesting. But study 1, that was a pretty controlled environment, right? Did they ever test this idea out in a more, real-world scenario?
They did, and that's study 2.
Hit me with it.
So they kept that basic market setup, the two products, the buyers and sellers.
Okay.
But they changed one key thing. Instead of having those bystanders as participants, the ones being directly affected,
right,
they linked the product choices to a donation to an actual charity.
Ooh, interesting. So no longer directly impacting other people in the study, but still a real-world consequence tied to their buying and selling decisions.
Precisely. The charity they chose was COTAB. They fund programs to address climate change and poverty.
Okay, so some seriously good work then, but less about that face-to-face impact of hurting someone else in the room.
Yeah, it was a way to see if those ethical considerations would still carry the same weight, even when the beneficiary was more abstract, not someone they could see or interact with directly.
Right. Okay, so what happened? Were people less generous, less likely to choose the ethical product when it was about a charity versus, impacting those bystanders?
You'd think so, right. But no. The discourse condition where they had those conversations before trading, it still led to a significant increase in people choosing the responsible product, even with the charity as the beneficiary.
So even when it's not as immediate, not as personal, the conversations still matter.
They do.
Okay, but hold on. Study 2 wasn't done yet, was it? They had that whole other twist with the experience condition.
You're good. Yes, They wanted to see what would happen if people, had some time to get used to the market first.
All right, it's like if they got into that competitive mindset of, I got to get mine, would the conversation still matter?
Exactly. So in this experienced condition, they ran 8 rounds of trading before anyone could talk.
8 rounds. It's enough time to really get set in your ways.
Right, and potentially get locked into a pattern of, prioritizing profit over those ethical considerations.
Okay, so people have their little market war for 8 rounds. Then they finally get to talk. What happened?
Even then, even after 8 rounds of making their own choices, the conversation still mattered.
Get out.
Yeah. People who got to discuss the ethical implications after those 8 rounds, they were still significantly more likely to choose the responsible product compared to those who didn't have that conversation.
So even when you've gotten used to acting a certain way, hearing those ethical concerns voiced by others, it can still shake things up.
It seems so. It really challenges the idea that our choices are purely driven by, ingrained habits or just pure self-interest.
Right, there's something about that social element, that back and forth, that can override those more individualistic tendencies.
Exactly. Which is, kind of heartening in a way.
It is. But, okay, before we get too optimistic, I gotta ask, how do we know it was the conversations themselves and not just the researchers leading the witness a little, maybe how they framed things, the questions they asked that could have been nudging people in a particular direction?
That's a really insightful point, and the researchers actually anticipated that very question. And to address it, they designed Study 3. We'll dive into that when we come back.
All right, back for the final act of this ethical consumption saga. And last we left off, we were wondering if maybe, just maybe, the researchers were, accidentally tipping the scales a bit. with how they ran those conversations.
Yeah, it's easy to unintentionally lead people towards a certain viewpoint, even with the best intentions. So study 3, that was all about addressing this researcher influence question head on.
Okay, so how do they try to take themselves out of the equation, conversationally speaking?
The instructions for the chats, they changed those up big time. Instead of using any language that could be seen as, encouraging ethical behavior.
Right, no more think about the impact, all that jazz.
Exactly. They switched to totally neutral prompts, as dry as possible.
Interesting. So stripping away any potential for subconscious bias.
That was the goal. But they had one more trick up their sleeve for study 3, the optional discourse condition.
Okay, gotta ask, what is optional discourse in this context?
Basically, people could choose if they wanted to chat or not before making their decisions in the market. It wasn't mandatory anymore.
Ooh, interesting. So in all the previous studies, everyone knew they were going to have to talk, which, maybe adds a layer of pressure. But with this optional setup, you really get to see how much people want to hash things out, and whether that choice changes how much influence those conversations actually have.
You got it. It gets at those questions of, do people naturally gravitate towards these discussions about ethics, even when there's no external pressure? And if they do, does it even matter for their behavior knowing they could have just sat it out?
Okay, I'm on the edge of my seat here. What they find?
Well, first off, most people still chose to chat. Even when given an out, the majority of participants were like, yeah, let's talk.
So we're social creatures by nature, even in a fake marketplace, apparently.
It seems that way. But, and this is a big but, that optional discourse, it basically had no effect on what people actually did in the market.
Hold up, really? So even though they chose to have those conversations about ethical stuff?
Didn't change their behavior one bit, at least not in a statistically significant way.
Whoa, okay, that is wild. We've got to unpack this. So people naturally want to have these conversations, but if you give them an escape hatch, it suddenly doesn't matter anymore. How does that even compute?
It is a head scratcher, right? But I think if we dig into it, there are a couple of things that might be going on. Remember how we talked about exposure to pro-social arguments from others being so crucial in those earlier studies?
Right. It wasn't just about what you believed walking in. It was about that group dynamic.
Exactly. And maybe when that conversation becomes optional, it changes the whole vibe. If you can just leave whatever, maybe you're not as invested in really understanding where other people are coming from or letting yourself be swayed by them.
Ooh, that is interesting. If there's an escape hatch, you don't have to fully immerse yourself. You can kind of dip your toes in, but you're not going to go for a full swim. You know what I mean?
Yeah, the stakes aren't as high.
Makes you wonder, is it similar in other parts of life? The difference between a casual chat with your buddies where you can agree to disagree and a structured debate where you have to actually grapple with the other side and maybe even, change your own mind.
Love that comparison. And this research might suggest that it's those more structured conversations, even if they're tougher in the moment, that are actually better at shifting behavior because there's that shared commitment to the process,
Fascinating stuff. Okay, so we've covered a ton of ground here. 3 whole studies, some real head scratchers, some hopeful nuggets. What would you say is the big takeaway for our listeners? What does it all mean?
Don't underestimate the power of genuine conversation, especially in our world today where it's easy to get caught up in marketing and online echo chambers, face-to-face dialogue, or even just screen-to-screen where you can actually share perspectives, challenge assumptions. This research suggests it can have a real impact on how we behave, even when it comes to tricky ethical dilemmas like this.
Right, and it's not about suddenly transforming everyone's values overnight, right?
Okay.
It's more about that social influence, recognizing that our choices aren't made in a vacuum. What other people think and expect, that matters, and it can actually influence our own actions.
100%. And that whole optional discourse thing, even though it was a bit of a puzzle at first, I think it offers a huge insight for anyone trying to promote ethical behavior, whether it's a company, a campaign, whatever. It's not enough to just throw information at people or even just create opportunities for discussion. You got to think about the structure, the format. How do you foster a sense of investment, of shared commitment, so people don't just check out when things get tough?
Right. Creating those spaces where people feel heard, but also challenged, where they're actually encouraged to wrestle with the tough questions.
Yeah.
So there you have it. Next time you're facing one of those choices where your wallet and your conscience are battling it out.
Classic dilemma.
Think about the conversations you've had, the ones you've overheard, even the ones you imagine other people having. They might be swaying you more than you realize. And who knows, maybe you'll be the one to start a conversation that leads to a more ethical choice, for yourself or for someone else. That's it for our deep dive into ethical consumption and the power of just talking to each other. Thanks for joining us.